So I'm just going to read for 5 minutes or something. Then we're going to have a talk, and then we'll take any questions if anybody has anything to ask. So for me, this is kind of interesting because I regard it as my final fucking reading for this book. It's been out for a year. But the paperback was just published, and it's funny, I have this kind of weird sense of feeling obliged to read something different when I read in the same area, even though it's not as if people come more than once to my readings, but so I'm kind of running out of material. But I came up with something to read tonight that had a little bit of a story behind it. I'm going to read this one short chapter. It's 4 or 5 pages. But it was written kind of in a different mode than the others. It comes from, in the book it's the second chapter, and it comes from when I had just started writing the book in 2006. And I was really just kind of floundering around. I did not know how to make the book work. I mean, I knew that I wanted to, I didn't want to censor myself. I knew that I wanted it to be classically an autobiography that followed the subject from point A to point B to point C, seeing how things changed, rather than being a memoir that just focused on some period or some relationship or something like that. But it was really hard to decide what to include, how much in the book myself to kind of comment on what was happening to this character as things went along. And when I started it, it was all over the map. And then that year in 2006, I got this request, a commission from Vice magazine, who were doing a fiction issue, and I wanted to contribute, and I didn't really have anything in particular that hadn't been published since I've been, focusing on this book. But I figured material that was related to the book could work, but then when I looked it over, as I said, it was all over the map, and I didn't know what to do. And then one night I went to a movie with my wife, and I had this little moment about the hair of the girl who was sitting in front of us as we were watching this movie. Actually, when I went to check today, the movie was Mutual Appreciation by Andrew Bujowski, which is a good movie. And that experience with the hair, it kind of triggered some memories from my childhood, and that's the period that I was working on as I began the book. So I wrote this piece intended for Vice, and to me it was really interesting because since I knew what the audience was, and another problem with the material that I'd already written, I mean, I had no problem with presenting it as fiction, I mean, even though it's nonfiction, but another problem was, as I said, it was all over the map, diffuse, and I know what people are looking for when they go to Vice, and I wanted to meet their needs. So that was definitely in my mind when I wrote this thing. And I was really happy with the way it came out. I have a cold. Sorry. And for a minute or two there, I was thinking, I'm going to write this entire book for Vice, for the Vice demographic, because it felt so good. It felt really natural to just be cold and sick, though it's honest too. I mean, it's not as if it was a real strain to be cold and sick. It came perfectly naturally. Sure. Anyway, so this is the result. It's a chapter like as one or a couple are that were dropped into the book that are kind of outside of the narrative, where the sort of present intrudes in a way, though it always relates to the past. Anyway, enough. Chapter 2. Yesterday there was a pretty girl sitting in front of my wife and me at a movie, and most of the time all I could see of her was her hair. When I sat behind girls in classrooms in grade school, their hair could drive me crazy. It wasn't even actually alive, but it was more affecting than most people's faces because of the intimate way it was involved with the girl it belonged to. It was out of my reach while being right there, completely exposed, with all its uncontrolled feral implications mixed with the messages of its grooming, and all of that heart-rendingly moving for the way its possessor was innocent of the effects. It was like spying on someone sleeping. In 3rd grade, I was crazy about Mimi McClellan. If I try to picture her, there's no face. There's just her dirty blonde hair and a big bouffant. But no one that young could have worn a bouffant like that when I think about it. It was 1958, and people didn't wear that hairdo until Jackie Kennedy showed up 2 or 3 years later. I would lie in my bed at night thinking of Mimi McClellan and fantasize getting hit by a car so that she would take my hand and I could tell her that I loved her. In the 6th grade, there was Janet Adelstein. It is probably Janet's hair I put on Mimi, because Janet did have a big dark blonde bouffant, preserved by hairspray, a silken mist, a soft, fragrant mesh of crystallization. The young girls wore white cotton blouses with ring-neck collars, and cardigans and culottes, maybe a delicate gold chain necklace and tennis shoes or bass loafers and bobby socks. Many of the girls had breasts by then. Janet's were larger than most. I never revealed my feelings to her either. A year or two later, we chanced on each other somewhere, and we talked, and it turned out she'd had a crush on me at the same time. That seemed tragic, Shakespearean. I can't remember when I started masturbating, but it was long before I could come. We boys thought there was something perverse and inferior about jacking off, having sex alone. I had this tactic for excusing it where I wouldn't start until I could give myself a hard-on without actually touching my penis, just by thinking. Considering those fantasies now, I wish I could see them as if they were movies. I was so ignorant about sex, it would be cool to see what I was picturing. I know Roy Baker's mother sometimes figured in them. He was like the next-door neighbor. There was a great Mad magazine spread in the 60s that featured photos of 3D versions of children's drawings. Photos of everyday objects constructed as if the children's drawings of them were accurate, such as a stubby little airplane with different length wings that pointed in different directions, and propellers on it that looked like broken matchsticks, and dripped misspelled words on its fuselage. Human works that don't hide the crudity of the approximate nature of their representation are the best. At the same time, the little I did know about the mechanics of sexual activity when I was 13 was plenty. Drawing a picture no more detailed than an infinity sign with a dot in the middle of each loop of it, and below that the outline of an hourglass that had a downward pointing triangle of scribble in the bottom center of it, was enough to give a boy a giant erection. I spent half the 8th grade having to walk with my school books held in front of my jeans to hide the sideways bulge. Sometimes a few drops of liquid would escape just from the friction of the fabric, and once or twice it then actually shuddered into spurts right there in the crowded corridor. When I eventually got a finger inside a vagina at 13 or 14, it was like being ordained into a new dimension, almost supernatural, as if I had pulled the sword from the stone. I went for a long walk afterwards, furtively passing my fingers under my nose every few hundred yards, the scent insignia of my kingdom. I didn't have full sexual intercourse until I was 15. My only interest in her was that I thought she might let me do that. Sex drive overcomes almost everything. Many have died behind their dicks. After all, where does reckless aggression come from but testosterone, and where does testosterone come from? Many have died, and many around them have been totally fucked, and often greatly liked it. But this unlucky girl didn't like it, or very much of anything else, as far as I could tell. She was a waitress at a big boy drive-in by the university. She was 19 and a hillbilly from Appalachia, and she was not just narrow-minded and ignorant, but dumb as a rock and about as energetic. I flirted with her when I'd go in for a hamburger. I told her I was a pre-med student. I walked her home from work. Soon, she gave me the key to her apartment. The making out was not relaxed. It was like hacking through wilderness brush that clung to your ankles and scratched your face as you struggled on further and further, your heart racing because the incentive was so powerful, namely female genitals, dripping wet pussy. In the end, her pussy wasn't even very wet. She was so nervous and put upon. Fucking her was horrible, though God knows I couldn't get enough. Even once her clothes were off and she was lying under me on the bed, she didn't participate, but resisted uncomfortably and for appearance's sake, all the way through full penetration, which she refrained from giving any sign of joining, but rather lay there stoically, performing only a last symbolic hip buck or two of denial and refusal. This was to confirm that she wasn't a disgusting person, but was permitting this terrible, embarrassing act as a begrudged extreme favor to me. I understand there still are cultural strata where this is standard behavior, even among married people. Thank God for pornography. Thank God for the sexual revolution and the pill and rebellious, fun-loving girls. Though I can't deny I am still repressed and American enough to like sex dirty. And I do love hair because it's dead but personal, and because I'm moved by the futility of its attempts to warm and protect the places where it grows. Oh, mercy.
I always thought that was a funny story, considering that one of the things you're famous for is a haircut, or inventing a haircut.
I'm sorry, considering what?
One of the things you're famous for is for inventing a haircut that's associated with punk. Is that like suicide, to cut off your hair when you were a hippie? But the hair was already dead. I love that chapter. The thing that I like the most about it is that I think that's the first place in the book where you intrude as a grown-up narrator, right? Where we're fully conscious of the fact that there's somebody writing this book who's separate from the character whose story is being told, and that in some ways the book starts to feel like a dialogue between the person who's sitting in the movies with his wife and then the memories or the sort of archival version of yourself that is left back in the past, whose records you're sorting through.
Yeah, well, as I said, I didn't really have a sort of system or a guiding principle when I started writing the book about how I was going to approach it. But ultimately I figured that since it was amounted to a self-portrait, that I was safe just trusting my instincts, and if in the course of writing it something arose like that, which came from the present, from the speaker that's behind the book, just include it. And I thought and it also just seemed like fun. So just to mix things up.
But there's a beautiful sequence too where you walk through Greenwich Village, making, self-consciously to go make a trip to the apartment where your grandmother had lived when you were a child, and sort of taking stock of the differences in the geography along the way, sort of differences that the city had undergone, and then locating yourself in that, almost a walk backwards through time.
Yeah, well, but because I was working on the book for a long time. I mean, I started it in 2006 and I finished it in 2011, and since it was my main preoccupation for those years, I mean, I carried out this and that other projects at the same time, but it was always on my mind. So basically, anything that happened was meat, so when that afternoon took place, I thought, this seems like it would be appropriate to put in the book, because it did refer to the past. But
I mean, for me, it's one of the things that locates it in the tradition of American autobiography rather than memoir, as you said, sort of drawing a distinction between those genres. I think of things like Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, where you have a sense of who Benjamin Franklin is, the dude who's writing this it's basically a letter to his son at the beginning, but there's a reason and a context for him writing it. Or Frederick Douglass's autobiography, where he makes reference to the person who he is as an author, and he makes reference to the moment at which he's writing, and you do that in places too. So you'll say, you'll talk about how difficult it is to come up with the words for the experience that you're trying to write about, or you'll comment on the difficulty of, say, writing about your own sexual behavior, so that the process of writing the autobiography actually becomes built in to the book, and the book becomes a reflection on how do you write about yourself. It's not
yeah, but I don't feel like there's that much attention paid to that. I mean, there's not that much emphasis on that. I mean, basically it's just a narrative, I mean, because for me a lot of the impetus, like a lot of my motivation in writing it was I was curious to find out if I just described fairly coldly, I mean, not coldly as if I were trying to deliberately be clinical, but just without any self-censorship, what had happened in my life, that I might be able to see myself, and I was curious to find out what that would look like, So, so when something. When some kind of comment on what I was writing did intrude in a way that seemed irrelevant, I would include it. But mostly it just tells a story. And my other main motivation was try to write a good book. I mean, I felt like as I was writing the book, I did learn more about what the subject was, and that I could come up with ways that would do that and sort of interesting patterns, as thinking of it as literature as well as just like reportage.
Right. I'm curious, did you think about the narrator of the book as a character, or was it you just thought of him as you? Because in some ways it would seem like...
it was totally me. I mean, it was all coming just... there was no distance, I mean, that was... Because that was part of what interested me in doing it. I wanted to not take a position. I just wanted... But, inescapably you do, to a certain degree, I mean, because you do... I mean... but that was always my criterion, was what came naturally to me, because after the book was done, I would keep getting these flashes of things that I completely left out, but I didn't care. I didn't go back and put them in, because my approach to it was to trust the way my own consciousness threw stuff up as I went along, and that was part of what being a self-portrait was too, because it's the shape of your own consciousness,
Yeah, I get that. I like that. I like the sense that you get as the book goes along, that part of the process of writing it was sorting or sifting or trying to figure out you can almost picture yourself as, I mean, I've sat in your archives in Vail's library and sifted through your life one sheet at a time, one folder at a time, but it strikes me that when you're writing this book, you almost get the feel that you're looking at some of these things too. Like you say, for instance, it happens fairly early, maybe first chapter. You say, you tell the story about running away from home, telling your dad you want to run away, and he says, "Okay, well, I'll help you. I'll take you out there to meet your buddies."
But if they're not there, you have to go home.
If they're not there, then you have to come back home. And then you tell the story, and then you say, and my mom doesn't remember it, my sister doesn't remember it, nobody remembers it. But guess what? I have a piece of paper right here where I wrote this story down when I was 7 years old, and it's almost like proof. It's like, it happened. And then what's funny to me about that...
Yeah, but I didn't even find that paper until after I'd written it, and everybody had made fun of me for telling a story that could not possibly.
And then what I love about it is it's not a diary entry, it's an autobiographical short story in which a 7-year-old said names have been changed. I mean, it strikes me, you've been writing autobiography for a very long time, but if you even think of the band bios that you wrote early on, where the band bios are little autobiographies. We burned down this
those
field.
Are a little
I blew up a school bus, and that's where I'm thinking: is there did you?
I mean, those were kind of written for effect, you know what I mean?
They are, but then they become part of the legend of the legendary quality of your career. And I wondered when you were writing the book, if you thought, okay, do I have to now just, instead of endorsing that old idea of print the legend, do you have to sift through the legend and figure out which parts of it do you allow to stand and which parts do you get rid of? Or did you feel a self-conscious impulse to demolish some of the legend?
Well, I mean, it's I don't know how interesting it is, but it is complicated, the whole issue of how much you trust your memory. I mean, it's been hashed over so much in recent decades, but there are a couple of cases in the book where I was suspicious of myself about whether I was remembering something in a self-serving way. I mean, that was something I was also super conscious of when I was writing the book, is that I wanted to avoid doing that. In fact, I bent over backwards to not describe my experience in a way that would make me look good.
Well, that's true. You actually sometimes, it almost feels confessional in a Catholic sense or something. You're like, I'm just going to tell you all of the bad shit that I did too, because if you're going to like this book, then you actually need to know the things that aren't actually very pretty.
Yeah, but even then, for instance, a little very small detail. Like, for instance, there's a scene in it where I talk about when I was 17 and how Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band got released, and how contemptuous of it I was. I might have exaggerated that a little bit. I mean, because like every junior high school kid, I thought the Beatles were glorious. I did get over it pretty quick, but and I really do think that album is ludicrous. But I'm not sure that it happened that early.
Right.
I'm not absolutely sure.
Right. I mean, one of the things that also I think is going on in this book, you start it with an anecdote about your childhood, where you say when everyone was young, and so you become a kind of representative figure, almost like in every American born in the 40s. But it's not. You don't even put it that way. It's like, this is
50s.
Well, 49. Although you lied about your age for a couple years.
2 years before 1950.
That's so right. I know your child.
I was in the 40s.
You're right. So
months.
the anecdote happened in the 50s.
Yeah.
Point taken.
Yeah.
But you talk about being of the genealogy of Hopalong Cassidy and being a cowboy, and it seems like then the story of the autobiography it's a story of an individual, but it's also it's an American story. There's It's a story of a couple decades in the life of America that begins with the influence of television on small children in the 50s.
Mm-hmm. I didn't think of it in those terms, so I was just describing my experience, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, but as I was saying before, it was important to me to include being a child, because that was part of what I was looking at, how things could have gone from here to here to here. So you needed to know where they began.
I wanted to ask you if that sense that you had of your childhood being mediated by television in a way that really, not the band, but the device, but in such a way that it helped shape who you are. If you feel like that is a story that fell away over time, I mean,
Well, you know, for me, talking about television, it wasn't so much about actually watching television. I mean, that is something that I think everybody from my generation, nearly everybody, has in common. It was more the idea of there not being any other roots. I mean, there weren't any ethnic, cultural. It was growing up in suburbia, watching television, going to public schools, which are pretty standardized, you know, and it didn't have these deep generational, you know, it's just like that was more the point, you know, that I didn't have very much foundation in a kind of worldview or family or anything like that.
And to me, as a cultural historian, I would think that that's what pop is about. Pop with a capital P, right? It's art that's produced out of that sensibility or that experience, where your culture then is Coca-Cola and Marilyn Monroe, and those are the sacred icons of your culture, because that's, you know, the way that an earlier generation might have been dragged to church by their ears or something. Yeah. And so then, when I was thinking about just the way that your story fits into whatever understanding I have of American history in these decades, or American popular culture, I was thinking that so the 60s in some ways is about a tension between artifice and authenticity, and someone like Warhol actually makes artifice authentic. And I wondered if that's something that you think carried over into your generation, which really defined the 70s, right? Especially in New York, especially downtown, the 70s culture. Does punk have a similar argument between artifice and authenticity? Because when people talk about punk now, it all has to be authentic. That's what punk is supposed to be. It's all authentic. But I feel like somehow, when you guys were starting off your career as a band, it feels a little bit more to me like pop. There's something pop about it. Have you ever thought of it in those terms?
You mean pop and
shooting in the
like
dark?
Pop art?
Yeah.
Or you mean pop like popular culture?
No,
like,
pop with like pop art, like meaning.
The Ramones were pop art, but for me, the thing that if there's anything that the bands of CBGBs had in common, there wasn't a lot, but to me, the way I've always looked at it was that they were trying to bring real life back to rock and roll, and for me personally,
it's kind of the authenticity side of it, in a way.
Well, yeah, but it's not something that you're self-conscious about being authentic. It's just you know, just I mean, in a way, that's the art part. You know, it takes a lot of art to describe what it's like to be alive and what things are around you, you know. But pop music didn't do that. It was just love songs, and it was just comfort and sentiment, you know.
So in some ways it's erasing the line between artifice
cliches,
and authenticity. So that art
for
is
me
life.
personally, it was also about being honest.
Yeah.
I mean, not pretending to be something other than what you were, and describing things as carefully as you could the way they look to you. You know what I mean?
I guess when you were writing the book, you talk late in the book about how difficult it is to write about certain things. So, and obviously there's a chunk of this book that's about the 70s and your career as a performer with television and the Voidoids and the Heartbreakers. But then you've got the last section of the book that's a lot more about drugs and sex. And you talk about how difficult it is to write about that. And I don't know if that difficulty is related to this whole question. How do you produce art out of parts of your life that are hard to write about? Or is that... How do you make art out of your personal experience when it's... like
well,
you said,
the art
like
is just trying to evoke it as effectively as possible. I mean, and that takes a lot of practice and a lot of focus and a lot of inspiration. And the only reason that there's a lot of sex and drugs in the last part of the book is because the book ends at a point where I was in my worst condition, and I'm describing what my experience was, and that was my experience. It wasn't like, okay, I'm going to insert sex and drugs here. I mean, in fact, I did my best, to keep it as brief as possible, that stuff, because it's monotonous. So I tried to explain, this is what it was like, and it happened, but I didn't dwell on it. I tried to give it the same weight it actually had in my life, which is that it pervaded my life, but the drugs part was pretty dull.
I definitely get that sense that you're talking about the repetition, but I like the way in those final chapters that the art of the narrative is also what's going on there. That it's not just about the difficulty of the experiences you're narrating, but it's that you actually, in the moment of composing the book, you're crafting something out of that feels, maybe, I don't know, transcendent is maybe too big of a word, but that there's a work of art that actually is responding to that experience, that maybe is the thing you're leaving behind. That you've made something out of that.
Well, I do think that that's a nice thing about being a writer. I've said this before, is that you can do nothing but jerk off all day, and as long as you describe it well, you've succeeded.
I think it's well put. It might be time to transition to Q&A with that.
Okay.
All right, Richard's going to take some questions now, so if anybody has anything, I'll come visit you with the microphone. Hands up. All right, I got one in the back.
You want this microphone? Is that what we're doing? What? I don't want to sit down. Put it up here.
So give us some titles that you were considering for this memoir, and how did you come up with the title to this memoir?
I do have a list of titles in my notes somewhere. I can't remember any of the others. But
you can't think of any of them?
It's funny because I just glanced over them today because they were in the same notes where I found the chapter. But I know a real early one that got rejected pretty quickly was Richard Hell by Richard Myers.
So what made you decide on this one?
Well, I can't remember exactly how early it occurred to me, but it was pretty early, and it stayed tentative for a long time. I mean, it's got its pros and cons, but I ended up really liking it. And I don't know if you've read the book, but the title comes from the story that he was describing, that he alluded to, that was something I wrote when I was 7 years old. It's a story about running away from home. Running away is also another running kind of theme in the book. So the story was sort of significant for that, because it was about this thing that was, was a thread through the book, this running away concept. But the actual thing that I wrote when I was 7 years old, it tells this anecdote about how I ran away one time that summer in 1957. The running away ends up failing, and the kid has to just go home and go to bed, and he ends the story saying that's what he did, and I dreamed I was a very clean tramp. For me, another thing about the book for myself that I kind of learned while I was working on it, or I probably was predisposed to think of it this way anyway, but that to me, even though that kid is just really innocent, he's a happy kid with a comfortable life, with a loving family, he ends up being me. But there's a way in which nothing ever changed. I mean, I still feel, because I am a very clean tramp. And that's my dream, anyway.
He probably didn't know what clean was going to mean in the context of...
But that's your interpretation.
Any other questions out there? I'm going to come to the back that way.
Okay, all right.
Hi. So you mentioned the process of writing a book as potentially a way to understand how the change from A to B to C happened.
Not necessarily how, but just to see it and then draw your conclusions. I mean.
So that wasn't the full question. I'm wondering if after finishing the book that you feel satisfied by, like, you feel like your question was answered about trying to understand something more, or if you feel like it didn't quite accomplish that.
I do, with a little caveat, which is also something I think is handy, because to my mind, I incorporate that into the book, which is, I mean, I could have written an entirely different book. I do feel like I fulfilled my aim, and I'm satisfied and glad about the book. But in the book, there's an epilogue where something that's been a strong component of the book, a message of it, which is that there's this guy who I hate. In the epilogue, I realize I don't hate him at all, and part of the point of that for me was that anything in the book could have been written the opposite. What?
The guy sounds really...
Yeah.
We got another one right down here.
You see what I'm saying? Like, it's built into the book for me, partly because of the way that's the way that epilogue demonstrates is that I could have described everything in a completely different way, but yeah, I'm happy with it.
Cool.
Yeah, I was thinking that since you said from your memory everything you was writing was meat, and you were writing the book for I think 5 or 6 years,
and we imagine you writing like every day, 8 hours constantly. So I was wondering, how much of the writing total, how much percent did you sort out, or did you leave away, or did you have someone that you could cross-check with what should be in the book finally or not?
You're asking like how much got edited out and how it got edited out? Is that what you're asking?
Well, the overall thing, because you said everything was meat when you remembered it.
Everything was what?
Everything was meat.
Meat?
It's meat, yeah. That's how I can recall what you said, but maybe I mistook it.
Yeah, but I just sort of started at the beginning, you know, and then went where I just followed my nose, you know. I didn't try to be systematic. I mean, I had all this material to refer to because I kept journals and notebooks for, you know, decades and decades, and my mom kept all my report cards, and I, you know, I had all this material to stimulate stuff, but I wasn't going about it as if I were writing a biography. I was trusting just what came to my mind as I was remembering how things went. But it did end up being a whole lot longer than what eventually got published. I cut like 25% of it. It was like 400 pages instead of 300 pages.
So did you select it in the end by your own, or did you?
No, I had a lot of help from both my agent and my editor. They were really great. But pretty much it was a couple of broad concepts that I shared with them about how to choose what to eliminate, and that was mostly. I have this bad tendency to interpret everything that the whole narrative, just the sequence of events that I'm describing. I have a tendency to then interpret them myself, you know, rather than just describing what happened. I'll then go on for another 3 paragraphs saying, that must mean this, which got really boring, was totally pointless, and would take away all the fun for anybody reading the book. So that's pretty much what I systematically eliminated. Yeah.
Other questions? All right, making my way to the back.
You left me with a job by doing that. Now I still have a job. So I can write about what you wrote.
Hi. I was just wondering, the downtown Manhattan and the East Village in particular has changed a lot in the past few decades, and a lot of people have gone so far as to declare it culturally bankrupt or no longer a place for artists. I was wondering how you feel about that, and also, like, what can be done? What can you do about that?
Yeah, it's really a shame that, you know, that the situation that existed for me. I mean, for me, that trade-off is totally worth it. That when I came to New York, things were filthy and crime-ridden, but there were plenty of jobs, plenty of cheap apartments, and all the cultural stuff that was available was as strong as it is now. You know, I mean, great museums, movies from all over the world playing all the time, and rock and roll clubs everywhere, great bookstores. Of course, bookstores don't exist anymore, most of them. And you know, I don't know what I would do if I was a kid now, because I hate roommates. And you really can't come to New York as a kid anymore unless you're going to be willing to live in like a dormitory, you know. I mean, so that's a huge loss now. I don't know. I thought maybe the big recession would clean shit up, but that doesn't seem to have happened.
Other questions? Yeah, one out here.
Hey. I just want to say I really appreciate how detailed you went into the book on letting us into like the back of the Wizard of Oz's tent, you know, like this is how I did it, this is what I was doing, and this is why.
You mean talking here?
No, I mean like the book.
In the book?
Yeah. Well, like when you're describing like when you came up with like what you were doing with the hair. The thing about the hair,
okay.
that was hilarious. But like that's the kind of thing. It really makes me think. What could you go into that process of like getting clear on when you have like a project, particularly like an artistic vector, what you want to do and like how you get clear on how you're going to do it? Because it seems, I mean, it's intimated in the book that you really, there was a lot under the surface that you didn't even mention in terms of thinking about it. I mean, the whole thing about just like the 2 rock and roll hairstyles, like that's genius, you know what I mean?
It's what?
It's genius. Like, you know, like there were 2 rock and roll hairstyles. There was like, you know, there was the ducktail and there was the Beatles bowl cut. Like, that's, you're like, you know, like how did that analysis come about? Like just organically, you know what I mean? Like,
I was trying to decide what to do with my hair. I just, you know, it's like I just did a little, I just thought about it.
We have time for one more. Another question? All right, last one.
Hi. Was there anything you were worried about including? Hi. Was there anything you were worried about including in the book, and how did you get over those concerns, if so?
If there was anything I was writing about that
you were worried about including in the book, and
I didn't leave anything out. That you know, I mean, I knew that there'd be negative reactions to some stuff that I wrote, but one thing that I did do when I was talking about sexual stuff and girlfriends I'd had, any woman who I'd gone out with, who I talk about in the book, if I knew how to reach her, I sent her what I wrote, and with the idea that if it was going to upset her, that I would change the name of the person and you know, maybe hair or something like that to make to make her unrecognizable, you know. But I really, you know, there were maybe 8 people I did that with, and there was only one who really had a problem, and there was another one who was a little dicey, and so I just did the safe thing and went ahead and changed her name. But, and if I couldn't reach them, but I knew, I thought that they were still alive, then I would use a different name because I didn't want to, you know, like blindside somebody. Okay.
Well, that's about all the time we have for tonight. Special thanks on behalf of the Strand to both Richard and Bryan for joining us tonight. We still have copies of Dreamed I Was a Very Clean Tramp, rather, the back of the room.